If you want to relax or listen to a great story, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the darkest secrets of the Fallout universe, the vaults. Behind every vault door was a promise of safety, but also a hidden experiment. From failed societies, to psychological horror, to genetic manipulation, each vault tells a different story about humanity. If you enjoy deep lore stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's step inside the vaults and uncover what really happened. Before the world ended, there was a promise. It came wrapped in cheerful advertisements featuring a smiling cartoon mascot with a blonde pompadour and an eternal thumbs up. Vault Boy, they called him, and he represented safety, security, a future when the present looked increasingly grim. In an America teetering on the brink of nuclear annihilation, where the resource wars had drained the earth dry and the conflict with China spiraled toward inevitable catastrophe, Vault-Tec Corporation offered hope in the form of buried steel and concrete. In the event of total atomic annihilation, the commercials promised, your family can take refuge in one of our state-of-the-art vaults, underground sanctuaries, they said. Tombs of salvation where American civilization could wait out the storm, preserve itself, and one day reclaim the surface world. 122 vaults scattered across the nation, each designed to house up to 1,000 people, equipped with water purification, sustainable agriculture, geothermal power, and everything needed for humanity to endure. The finest minds in pre-war America labored to create these marvels of engineering, these steel wombs where the species could gestate a new beginning. But beneath the cheerful propaganda and the reassuring corporate jargon, something far more sinister gestated. The vaults were never meant to simply save lives. They were laboratories, testing chambers, the largest behavioral experiment in human history, with unwitting subjects who thought they were the lucky ones. On the 23rd of October 2077, at 9:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the bombs fell. The Great War lasted 2 hours. Civilization ended in nuclear fire, and those who made it to the vaults thought they had escaped hell. They were wrong. They had only just entered it. The California vaults, where it all began. Vault 12, the Ghoul Genesis. Bakersfield, California stood as an agricultural center before the bombs transformed it into something else entirely. Beneath the city, Vault 12 promised refuge to its citizens. The advertising campaign emphasized its state-of-the-art water purification system, superior to other vaults, a beacon of Vault-Tec's commitment to quality. What the citizens didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that their vault door had been designed with a fatal flaw. The door would never fully seal. This was not an engineering mistake. This was the experiment. Vault-Tec scientists wanted to study radiation's effects on a controlled population, to observe the transformation that occurred when human beings absorbed just enough fallout to mutate, but not enough to die immediately. The door would remain perpetually ajar, allowing radiation to seep through in measured doses, turning the vault into a slow-cooking chamber of genetic transformation. When the sirens screamed that October morning, Bakersfield citizens rushed to their salvation. Families clutched children, lovers held hands, the elderly moved as quickly as failing bodies allowed. They made it inside. They thought they were safe. The door closed, but not completely. In the weeks that followed, the first symptoms appeared. Hair loss, lesions, the slow deterioration of flesh that would mark the beginning of ghoulification. Some died quickly, their bodies unable to withstand the cellular degradation. But others changed. Their skin became leathery, mottled, resembling burned meat left too long in the sun. Noses rotted away, leaving gaping holes. Ears withered. But consciousness remained. Memory persisted. They were still human inside bodies that looked increasingly monstrous. By 2083, the survivors of Vault 12 could no longer deny what they had become. Ghouls. Not quite human anymore, but not yet dead. They emerged from the vault and established Necropolis, the city of the dead, in the ruins of Bakersfield. Here, they created a society of the transformed, led by Set, a ghoul who had once been human enough to remember what that meant. Necropolis would stand for decades as a monument to Vault-Tec's cruelty, a city of living reminders that the corporation's experiments cared nothing for human dignity or suffering. The ghouls of Vault 12 had survived, but the price of survival had been their very forms. The experiment produced valuable data on radiation-induced mutation. Whether anyone remained alive to read that data, or whether it mattered in a world reduced to ash, was another question entirely. Vault 13. The prolonged isolation experiment. Deep in the California wastes, Vault 13 was designed for a specific purpose: to remain sealed for 200 years, not as a safety measure, but as an experiment in prolonged isolation. What happened to a society cut off from the outside world for generations? How would they adapt? Would they thrive, or would isolation breed madness? The vault was well equipped for its purpose: sustainable hydro-agricultural farms, advanced water purification, enough supplies to last centuries. The overseer was given explicit instructions: never open the door, never let anyone leave. Observe the effects of complete isolation on a closed society. But even the best laid plans contain variables beyond control. In the 2,160 seconds, Vault 13's water purification chip, a critical component of their survival system, began to fail. The overseer faced an impossible choice: follow Vault-Tec's protocol and watch everyone die of thirst, or break the cardinal rule and send someone into the wasteland to find a replacement. He chose survival over obedience. A young man, later known simply as the Vault Dweller, was selected for this desperate mission. Given a 10mm pistol, some supplies, and the coordinates to Vault 15, which might have spare parts, he was sent into a world his people had never known. A world his Vault-Tec education had told him was still a radioactive hellscape where nothing could survive. What he found instead was a wasteland that had adapted. Mutants, raiders, new societies forming from the ashes, and threats beyond imagination, including a being called the Master, who sought to transform all humanity into super mutants through the forced evolutionary virus. The Vault Dweller succeeded in his mission. He found not just a water chip, but confronted and defeated the Master, preventing the transformation of the human species. He returned to Vault 13 a hero, expecting gratitude. Instead, he received exile. The Overseer, having broken protocol once, could not allow the contamination to continue. The Vault Dweller had seen too much, experienced too much of the outside world. His very presence threatened the experiment's integrity. If others learned that the wasteland was survivable, they might want to leave. The isolation would end. So the savior of Vault 13 was banished into the wastes he had just finished saving, forbidden from ever returning to the only home he had known. Years later, in 2241, the Enclave, a remnant of the pre-war government, discovered Vault 13's existence. They activated an all-clear signal, convincing the inhabitants it was finally safe to emerge after generations underground. The door opened. Enclave soldiers were waiting. The dwellers of Vault 13 were rounded up, loaded onto vertibirds, and taken to an oil rig off the coast of California. There, the Enclave subjected them to new experiments, using them as test subjects for various projects. The prolonged isolation experiment had ended, but only to begin different tortures under a different cruel hand. Some of the captured dwellers were later rescued by the Chosen One, the Vault Dweller's grandchild, but Vault 13 itself was lost. Later still, the Enclave would use Vault 13 for another purpose, creating intelligent death claws through genetic manipulation, attempting to forge perfect soldiers from the wasteland's most terrifying predators. The experiment in isolation had failed, but it had succeeded in creating something else, a lineage of heroes who would shape the wasteland's future, even if Vault-Tec never intended such an outcome. Vault 15, the experiment in diversity. While Vault 13 tested isolation, Vault 15 tested something different: ideological conflict. What happened when you sealed people of radically different worldviews in a confined space? Could democracy and diplomacy survive when extreme ideologies collided underground? Vault-Tec selected inhabitants specifically for their diverse and often contradictory beliefs, socialists, capitalists, anarchists, authoritarians, religious fundamentalists, and militant atheists. Every spectrum of political thought crammed together beneath the California desert. The vault was designed to stay sealed for 50 years, giving time for these ideologies to clash, combine, or consume each other. The scientists wanted to see if common cause could emerge from uncommon beliefs, or if tribalism would tear everything apart. In 2097, after its scheduled opening, Vault 15 emerged into the wasteland. But the inhabitants didn't emerge as one unified people. They fractured along ideological lines, splintering into separate groups that would go on to shape the wasteland in different ways. From Vault 15 came Aradesh, who would found the peaceful settlement of Shady Sands, which later grew into the New California Republic, one of the wasteland's most successful post-war civilizations. From the same vault came others who would form raider gangs, viewing might as the only right in a world without law. The Khans, one of the wasteland's most notorious raider tribes, traced their lineage to Vault 15. So did the Vipers and the Jackals, groups that terrorized the wastes for generations. The same cradle that birthed the NCR also birthed its enemies. By the time the Vault Dweller discovered it in 2161, Vault 15 had been picked clean by raiders, its interior collapsed and uninhabitable. The experiment had concluded decades earlier, its subjects scattered to become the founders of wasteland factions that would war with each other for centuries. Vault-Tec had wanted to know if diversity could thrive in confinement. The answer was no, but diversity could survive, splinter, and spawn entirely new civilizations in the wasteland beyond. Whether this counted as success or failure depended on whose metrics you used. Vault 8, the control group that became a city. Not every vault was designed for cruel experiments. 17 vaults were designated as control groups, places that function exactly as advertised, providing genuine shelter and safety. These control vaults were necessary for Vault-Tec's broader experiment, providing baseline data against which to measure the results from the experimental vaults. Vault 8, located in Northern California, was one such control. It was designed to open after 10 years, allowing its inhabitants to recolonize the surface and rebuild civilization. It operated smoothly, efficiently, without hidden agendas or secret protocols. When 2091 arrived, the vault opened on schedule. What emerged would become Vault City. The inhabitants of Vault 8 brought with them the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, GECK, a miraculous device containing seeds, soil supplements, matter-energy converters, and everything needed to transform wasteland into fertile ground. They used it well, creating a thriving settlement with working infrastructure, medical technology, and standards of living that rivaled pre-war America. But success bred its own problems. Vault City became insular, elitist, convinced of its superiority over wasteland natives. Citizens enjoyed the benefits of advanced technology and comfort, but the city relied on servants, wasteland, refugees, granted conditional status, always one mistake away from expulsion. Slavery in all but name infected a society born from a vault designed to save humanity. The control experiment had worked as intended. Vault 8 proved that Vault-Tec's technology could preserve civilization and facilitate rebuilding. But it also demonstrated something the scientists might not have anticipated: that privilege and safety, when distributed unequally, created new forms of cruelty even without deliberate experiments in suffering. Vault 4, the scientists' playground. Hidden in the California wastes, Vault 4 represented one of Vault-Tec's most ethically bankrupt concepts. The vault was staffed with scientists, 80 of them, and given a mandate that chilled the blood. They would have complete freedom to conduct experiments on the human body, testing the limits of genetic manipulation and radiation resistance with no oversight, no regulations, and no accountability. Surface refugees, promised safety from the nuclear holocaust, were lured into Vault 4. What they found instead was a laboratory where they became unwilling test subjects for grotesque experiments. The scientists conducted genetic splicing, attempting to combine human DNA with radiation-resistant creatures. They created hybrid monstrosities, gulpers, and other abominations that retained some human intelligence but were physically transformed into something that could theoretically survive in irradiated environments. Some experiments involved forced impregnation of female subjects with mutated embryos. Others involved cryogenic testing, radiation exposure trials, and surgeries without anesthesia, all meticulously documented in research logs that treated human suffering as data points. But human beings, even transformed ones, retained the capacity for rebellion. The creations of Vault 4 scientists eventually revolted. They killed their tormentors, tore through the vault, and claimed it for themselves. When the dust settled, Vault 4 had transformed from a laboratory into a sanctuary now run by the descendants of those mutated subjects and refugees who had managed to survive with some semblance of humanity intact. By the time Lucy McLean discovered it in 2296, Vault 4 had become a haven for the displaced and the different. Its leaders, despite their mutations, showed more compassion than the scientists ever had. They took in survivors from Shady Sands after that city's destruction, offering shelter without asking for anything in return. The experiment had created monsters, but those monsters proved more human than their creators. Vault 4 stood as a testament to resilience and a reminder that cruelty, even conducted in the name of science, ultimately produces only more suffering. The Tri-Vault Conspiracy, Vaults 31, 32, and 33. Some vaults operated in isolation. Others were designed to work in concert. Their experiments interlinked in ways the inhabitants could never suspect. Such was the case with 3 vaults built in close proximity near Los Angeles, Vaults 31, 32, and 33. From the outside, they appeared to be simple residential vaults, designed to preserve normal American life underground. The inhabitants of Vaults 32 and 33 went about their days believing in their sacred purpose. They were preserving humanity, growing crops, maintaining their little underground societies until Reclamation Day arrived and they could return to the surface to rebuild America. They had no idea they were breeding stock. Vault 31 was the secret heart of the Tri-Vault system. While 32 and 33 housed regular citizens, Vault 31 contained something else. Vault Tech executives and employees, the corporation's elite, preserved in cryogenic suspension. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. When leadership positions opened in Vaults 32 and 33, when overseers died or retired, new leaders would emerge from Vault 31, presented as coming from the sister vaults but actually being thawed Vault-Tec loyalists. These leaders would encourage marriages between Vaults 32 and 33, orchestrating bloodlines, creating a gene pool designed to produce the most loyal possible Vault-Tec employees. Generation after generation, the inhabitants of 32 and 33 would believe they were simply continuing humanity, never knowing they were being bred like livestock to create perfect corporate managers for a company that no longer existed. But the experiment required the inhabitants to never discover the truth. In Vault 32, they discovered it anyway. Someone found evidence. Perhaps a hidden terminal with incriminating files. Perhaps one of the cryo-preserved overseers said something that didn't add up. However it happened, the truth spread through Vault 32 like radiation through a broken seal. They learned they weren't sacred preservers of humanity. They were a eugenics experiment, their bloodlines manipulated by corporate fascists who viewed them as genetic resources to be harvested. The revelation destroyed Vault 32. Some tried to force their way into Vault 31 to confront their puppet masters. Others turned on each other, paranoia and rage fracturing the community. Cannibalism began. Murder, suicide. The writings on the walls chronicled their despair, their fury, their sense of betrayal so profound that death seemed preferable to continued existence. By the time raiders infiltrated Vault 32 years later, they found only corpses. The experiment had killed its subjects not through direct violence, but through the simple act of truth. Meanwhile, in Vault 33, life continued in blissful ignorance. Lucy McLean grew up believing in the goodness of Vault-Tec, in the nobility of their preservation mission, in the promise of Reclamation Day. Her father, Hank McLean served as overseer, a position he had earned but which had actually been granted because he was one of the cryopreserved employees from Vault 31. When raiders attacked during Lucy's wedding, killing and kidnapping residents, the event triggered a cascade of discoveries. Lucy's brother Norm, suspicious and intelligent, began investigating. He found Vault 32's corpses. He discovered Vault 31's cryopods. He learned that his father wasn't who he claimed to be. The Tri-Vault experiment had been designed to run for generations, slowly breeding a population of perfect Vault-Tec devotees. But like so many of the corporation's experiments, it had underestimated one crucial factor. Human beings eventually ask questions. And once they start asking questions, no amount of corporate propaganda can silence them forever. The Capitol Wasteland, Washington, D.C.'s Chambers of Horror, Vault 101, the vault that never opens. In the ruins of Washington, D.C., Vault 101 represented perhaps the most psychologically insidious experiment in the entire Vault-Tec repertoire. The concept was simple: a vault that would never open. Not in 10 years, not in 100. Never. The experiment aimed to observe the effects of perpetual isolation on an overseer-run society. How would power dynamics evolve when there was no outside world, no higher authority, no escape? Would the overseer become a tyrant? Would democracy emerge? Would the inhabitants accept their eternal imprisonment or rebel against it? In Vault 101, "No one ever enters and no one ever leaves" became the unofficial motto, drilled into every resident from birth. The Vault-Tec Corporation, in a masterstroke of psychological manipulation, made this isolation seem noble. Vault 101's inhabitants were told they were preserving pure humanity, untouched by the wasteland's mutations and barbarism. They were the control group, the baseline, the perfect humans who would one day, though no one knew when, emerge to reclaim and repopulate America. Generations passed. Families lived and died having never seen the sun. Children grew up in metal corridors illuminated by fluorescent lights, learning about the outside world only through educational films that emphasized its dangers and horrors. The overseers wielded near absolute power, their authority justified by the need for order in a closed system. Some were benevolent, others became increasingly authoritarian. The isolation bred its own pathologies: paranoia about contamination from the outside, rigid social hierarchies, the GOAT, generalized occupational aptitude test system that assigned life roles based on a standardized test taken at age 16. Then came the day when James, a resident scientist, left the vault. He opened the door and walked out, seeking Project Purity, a water purification initiative that could clean the Capitol Wasteland's irradiated water. This action, considered impossible, shattered the psychological foundation of Vault 101. His child, the Lone Wanderer, followed him years later, setting in motion events that would expose Vault 101 to the wasteland, whether it wanted exposure or not. The vault experienced its first radroach infestation, a consequence of the door being opened. The overseer, Alphonse Almodovar, struggled to maintain control as residents began questioning the necessity of eternal isolation. The experiment ended not with scientific observation, but with ideological fragmentation. Some residents wanted to seal the vault forever, terrified of contamination. Others wanted to open it, to establish trade with the wasteland, to stop living in fear of a world that had proven survivable. Still others wanted limited opening controlled contact that preserved isolation while allowing necessary exchanges. The Lone Wanderer's choices would determine Vault 101's fate, but by that point, the original experiment had already failed. You cannot make people believe in eternal imprisonment once they've tasted freedom, even if that freedom is just the knowledge that freedom exists. Vault 87, the super mutant factory, deep within the Capitol Wasteland, near the radioactive ruins of downtown Washington, D.C. Vault 87 conducted experiments that would have horrified even the most callous Vault-Tec scientists if any of them had survived to see the results. The experiment involved the Forced Evolutionary Virus, FEV, a pre-war bioweapon designed to create super soldiers. Vault 87 had been equipped with FEV samples and a mandate to test the virus on human subjects, studying mutation rates, intelligence retention, and physical transformation. When the vault sealed in 2077, the inhabitants had no idea they were about to become test subjects in humanity's transformation. Within weeks, the scientists began exposing residents to FEV in controlled environments, documenting every stage of the horrific metamorphosis. Human beings don't transform into super mutants quickly or painlessly. The process involves cellular reconstruction at the molecular level. Skin thickens and turns greenish yellow. Muscles expand exponentially. Bones strengthen and lengthen. Intelligence, well, that's where things became complicated. Most subjects lost cognitive function entirely, becoming rage-filled giants with the reasoning capacity of animals. They screamed in agony during transformation, their minds shattering as their bodies mutated. Some died from the shock. Those who survived often retained only primal instincts: hunger, violence, territorial aggression. But occasionally, a subject retained intelligence. These rare individuals became the super mutant leaders, cunning, strategic, dangerous, in ways their mindless cousins could never be. The scientists documented everything: optimal FEV exposure levels, mutation success rates, intelligence degradation curves. They thought they were advancing science, creating weapons for America's defense, or perhaps engineering a post-human species better adapted to the wasteland. They didn't anticipate that their creations would rebel. The super mutants, even the mindless ones, recognized their creators as enemies. They broke containment, slaughtered the scientists, and claimed Vault 87 for themselves. The mutations continued, now self-directed rather than laboratory-controlled, as the super mutants raided the capital wasteland, capturing humans to drag back to the vault for forced FEV exposure. "Join us" became their terrifying mantra. Become one of us. Become strong. They created an army, a society of mutants that would terrorize the capital wasteland for decades. Some super mutants, like Fox, retained enough humanity to reject the violence and seek redemption. But most became exactly what Vault 87 had designed them to be: weapons, monsters, symbols of science's capacity for creating horrors it cannot control. By the time the lone wanderer discovered Vault 87, radiation levels outside the main entrance had risen so high that approaching without specialized equipment meant instant death. The vault had become inaccessible from the front, its interior a hellscape where mutants tortured new captives and the FEV vats continued their grim work. The experiment had succeeded in creating super mutants. It had failed in every other conceivable way, unleashing on the wasteland a threat that would persist for generations, long after every Vault-Tec employee had turned to dust. Vault 92, the white noise experiment. Vault-Tec advertised Vault 92 as a sanctuary for America's finest musicians, violinists, pianists, composers, conductors, the cultural elite who would preserve humanity's artistic heritage underground. The vault featured state-of-the-art recording studios, practice rooms, a concert hall, and instruments of exceptional quality. What the musicians didn't know was that they were test subjects in a military experiment. The objective: create sleeper agents through subliminal manipulation. Vault 92 would expose its inhabitants to white noise broadcast sounds specifically engineered to bypass conscious awareness and implant behavioral suggestions directly into the subconscious mind. Over time, these broadcasts would condition the musicians to become aggressive, violent, programmable assets who could be activated with specific audio triggers. The experiment began subtly. Residents noticed they were sleeping poorly. Some reported strange dreams, violent nightmares that left them disturbed upon waking. Others experienced headaches, irritability, sudden mood swings they couldn't explain. The white noise transmissions continued, every night, every day, invisible, inescapable, wearing away at sanity, like water wearing away stone. Professor Malleus, the overseer, documented the deteriorating mental state of his residents. He noted increased aggression during rehearsals. Musicians who had once collaborated peacefully now argued over minor details. Fistfights broke out, instruments were smashed in fits of rage. And then, one day, the programming reached critical mass. The residents of Vault 92 turned on each other in an orgy of violence. Musicians who had spent decades perfecting their art used their instruments as weapons. Violin bows became stabbing implements. Pianos were toppled onto victims. The concert hall became a slaughterhouse, blood spattering the elegant walls, bodies piled among shattered cellos and destroyed scores of Beethoven. Some tried to escape, desperate to flee the madness consuming everyone around them. But Vault 92's door had sealed, and there was no leaving. The white noise continued to broadcast, pushing the survivors past aggression into homicidal mania. When the killing finally stopped, everyone was dead. The experiment had succeeded in creating aggressive, violent subjects. It had failed to demonstrate that these subjects could be controlled or useful. The military had wanted sleeper agents. Instead, it had created a vault full of corpses and a sound system that still broadcast its insane frequencies into empty corridors. Later, when Wastelanders discovered Vault 92, they found terminals documenting the experiment, audio logs of Professor Malleus's growing horror as he realized what was being done to his people and his own complicity in their destruction. They found practice rooms still stained with blood, instrument cases that had become coffins, evidence of humanity's capacity to weaponize even beauty and art. The white noise had achieved its purpose. It had proven that human behavior could be modified through subliminal audio manipulation. The price of that knowledge had been the lives and sanity of everyone in Vault 92, transformed from artists into murderers, their final performance a symphony of screams. Vault 106, the psychoactive drugs experiment. 10 days after Vault 106 sealed its door, psychoactive drugs began pumping through the air filtration system. The residents had no warning. They went to sleep thinking they were safe, protected, preserved. They woke up in hell. The drugs induced hallucinations, paranoia, and violent delusions. Vault-Tec scientists wanted to study the long-term psychological effects of exposure to hallucinogenic compounds in a confined environment. What happened to the mind when reality itself became unreliable? How did communities fracture under the weight of shared psychosis? Dr. Albert Laris, the overseer, was aware of the experiment. He had been briefed by Vault-Tec, told to monitor and document but not intervene. As the drugs took effect, he watched his people descend into madness, writing clinical observations while residents screamed about demons that didn't exist and attacked loved ones they no longer recognized. Some vault dwellers experienced vivid, terrifying hallucinations, walls bleeding, monsters emerging from shadows, the faces of family members melting and reforming into grotesque masks. Others suffered paranoid delusions, convinced that their neighbors were conspiring to kill them, that the overseer was a spy, that the vault itself was a prison designed to break them. Violence erupted. Residents attacked each other, believing they were defending themselves against threats that existed only in drug-addled minds. Some committed suicide to escape hallucinations too horrible to endure. Others formed paranoid factions, barricading themselves in sections of the vault, fighting imaginary wars against imaginary enemies. The drugs continued pumping, relentless, inescapable. The air itself became poison. Dr. Laris's logs became increasingly fragmented, his own sanity eroding as he breathed the same air as his subjects. His final entries speak of shadows moving, voices whispering, an inability to distinguish between observation and delusion. Eventually, everyone in Vault 106 died or went completely insane. Decades later, when Wastelanders entered the vault, the psychoactive compounds were still circulating through the air filtration system. Visitors experienced the same hallucinations that had driven the original inhabitants to madness. Blurred vision, phantom figures, reality sliding sideways into nightmare territory. The experiment had produced extensive data on drug-induced psychosis. It had demonstrated that sustained exposure to hallucinogenic compounds could completely destroy a human society. Whether this knowledge had any practical application, whether anyone could use it for anything except inflicting suffering, remained an open question. Vault 108, the Gary problem. Vault 108's experiment tested what happened when a vault was deliberately designed to fail. The basic infrastructure, power, water, life support was all programmed to malfunction prematurely. Instead of lasting the projected 100 years, systems would begin failing after 20. Additionally, Vault 108 featured cloning technology. The overseer would die after approximately 1 year. There were no secondary power supplies. But there was a cloning lab, ostensibly for medical purposes. A man named Gary was one of Vault 108's residents. For reasons that remain unclear, possibly a scientific interest in cloning, possibly desperation as the Vault's infrastructure failed, possibly simple hubris, Gary created clones of himself. Not perfect clones, not stable clones. Clones with each iteration becoming progressively more violent and less intelligent. The first Gary clones were nearly identical to the original, but replication errors accumulated with each generation. Gary 2 was slightly more aggressive than Gary 1. Gary 3 had reduced cognitive function. By Gary 54, the clones were essentially feral, capable of only limited speech, usually just variations on the name Gary. As the Vault systems failed and resources dwindled, the Garys decided that non-Gary residents were the problem. They began systematically killing everyone else in the Vault, working in packs, overwhelming victims through numbers. The slaughter was thorough. Scientists, engineers, families, anyone who wasn't Gary, died screaming, while an army of deteriorating clones repeated the name Gary like a mantra, a war cry, the only word most of them could remember. When the last non-Gary resident died, Vault 108 became a tomb filled exclusively with Gary clones of varying degradation levels. Some retained enough intelligence to operate basic machinery. Others had devolved into violent animals who could only speak their name. Gary? They would call to each other through the corridors. Gary would come the response. It was greeting, question, statement, threat, everything compressed into a single syllable because nothing else remained in their deteriorating minds. The experiment had tested resource scarcity and leadership failure. It had accidentally created one of the wasteland's strangest horrors, a vault full of hostile clones, all named Gary, all increasingly violent, existing in a slowly dying facility that perfectly mirrored their own genetic degradation. Later, visitors to Vault 108 would encounter the Garys, fighting for their lives against waves of clones who spoke only one word. It was almost comical until the Garys started killing you, and you realized that this entire vault represented the ultimate failure of both science and humanity, reduced to endless copies of the same man, each one a little worse than the last, trapped in a metal tomb of their own making. Vault 112, Tranquility Lane's Nightmare. Vault 112 was one of the last vaults constructed, completed in 2074, and it represented perhaps the most philosophically disturbing experiment in the entire Vault Tech program. Unlike the others, this Vault's experiment would trap its subjects in virtual reality, suspending them in cryogenic pods while their consciousnesses lived out endless simulations. The mastermind was Dr. Stanislaus Braun, creator of the Garden of Eden creation kit, and one of the most brilliant and sadistic minds in pre-war America. Braun had developed advanced virtual reality technology and wanted to test it on human subjects. Vault 112 gave him that opportunity, along with something else, immortality and absolute power. Only 85 people were selected for Vault 112. When the bombs fell, they entered the vault, were told they would experience paradise in virtual reality while their bodies were preserved, and were placed in Tranquility Lounger's advanced pods that would keep them alive indefinitely while their minds inhabited a digital heaven. What they got instead was hell, carefully designed by a man who had grown bored with godhood. The simulation was called Tranquility Lane, an idyllic 1950s American suburb where residents lived in perfect houses with white picket fences, where the sun always shone, where nothing ever went wrong. It should have been paradise. But Dr. Braun, the simulation's god, had grown tired of paradise. He had been running simulations for 200 years, and beauty had lost its appeal. He wanted entertainment. He wanted to watch suffering, so he began to play. In Tranquility Lane, residents couldn't die permanently. They would die, respawn, and have their memories partially wiped so they wouldn't remember what had happened, but they would retain just enough trauma to feel perpetual unease. Dr. Braun, appearing in the simulation as a little girl named Betty, would orchestrate sadistic scenarios, make a resident lose his wife in increasingly horrible ways, force someone to torture their best friend, arrange accidents that were clearly murders, create love triangles that ended in violence, destroy families, corrupt innocence, break every character in unique, personalized ways. And when the residents broke, when they couldn't take anymore, he would reset everything and start again. The same people, the same torture, an eternal loop of suffering disguised as suburban normalcy. The residents of Vault 112 had been living this nightmare for over 200 years when the lone wanderer arrived. Some, like Betty Braun, the real doctor, Braun's avatar, had gone completely mad with power. Others, like Timmy Neusbaum, barely remembered that any reality existed outside Tranquility Lane. James, the lone wanderer's father, had entered Vault 112 searching for information and become trapped in the simulation. Braun wouldn't let him leave, relishing the chance to torture a new subject. The only way to escape Tranquility Lane was to either complete Braun's latest sadistic game, making residents kill each other, or to find a hidden failsafe that would terminate all the simulation's residents, permanently, finally ending their virtual suffering through virtual death. It was a choice between temporary suffering or permanent release, and either option meant playing God just as Braun had played God for 2 centuries. Vault 112's experiment had tested long-term virtual reality suspension. It had succeeded. The technology worked perfectly. Humans could live indefinitely in simulated environments. But it had also demonstrated something darker. Give one person absolute power over others' reality, and that person becomes a monster. Not because the power corrupts, but because the boredom does. Dr. Braun, trapped in his own creation, had devolved from scientist to sadist, from creator to destroyer, proving that immortality without purpose produces only cruelty. The Mojave Wasteland, New Vegas's experiments in humanity. Vault 3, the control that failed. Vault 3, located in South Vegas, was another control vault designed to operate normally, to open after a set period, to function exactly as advertised. For decades, it did exactly that. Families grew crops, children were educated, life continued in relative comfort and safety. The inhabitants agreed on a simple rule. They would not leave the vault until 20 years after sealing. This wasn't a Vault-Tec mandate, but a community decision, a collective agreement that they would wait until the surface was surely safe before emerging. 20 years passed, but the community had grown cautious. They voted to stay longer, another generation, just to be sure. They had created their own experiment in voluntary isolation, and it was working beautifully until a water leak forced the issue. The lower chambers began flooding. The leak couldn't be repaired with available resources. The vault was slowly drowning from below. Finally, reluctantly, the residents of Vault 3 opened their door and emerged into the Mojave. They brought with them hope, technology, the intention to rebuild. They carried supplies for establishing a surface settlement, knowledge for growing crops in the desert, medical expertise, engineering skills. They were ready to reclaim the wasteland and establish trade with whatever communities had formed during their underground isolation. Instead, they met the Fiends. The Fiends were raiders, chem-addicted, violent, sociopathic wasteland predators who saw Vault 3's residents not as fellow humans, but as prey. The Vault dwellers, unprepared for such raw brutality, were slaughtered. Some died quickly. Others were tortured for entertainment. A few might have been captured and subjected to fates worse than death before being killed. The Fiends took Vault 3 for themselves, turning it into a stronghold filled with drugs, weapons, and the corpses of the people they'd murdered. The vault that had functioned perfectly, that had preserved its inhabitants for generations, had failed at the only thing that truly mattered, preparing its people for the reality of the wasteland. The control experiment had succeeded internally, but failed at the interface between preservation and reality. Vault 3's residents had survived the bombs, survived centuries underground, only to die within hours of emerging killed, not by radiation or mutation, but by the simple fact that they'd been protected too well, sheltered too long, left unprepared for a world that had become savage in their absence. Vault 11, the democratic sacrifice. Deep in the Mojave wasteland, Vault 11 conducted an experiment so psychologically cruel, so philosophically perverse, that discovering its truth would drive most of its inhabitants to suicide. The experiment was simple. Every year, the residents of Vault 11 were required to sacrifice one person. The Vault's computer would announce that a sacrifice was necessary to ensure everyone else's survival. If they refused to provide a sacrifice, everyone would die. This was presented as absolute fact, backed by the weight of Vault-Tec's authority and the survival imperative. Faced with a choice between sacrificing one or watching everyone die, the residents did what humans do. They rationalized the horror. They created a democratic system for choosing the sacrifice. At the start of each year, the residents would elect an overseer through normal democratic processes. This person would lead the vault for 1 year, wielding authority, making decisions, guiding the community. And at the end of that year, the overseer would be led into a chamber and executed. The system was elegant in its cruelty. It created a situation where leadership became a death sentence, where anyone who wanted power had to accept execution as the price. It meant that the overseer election essentially became a vote for who would die democracy, weaponized into an annual murder ritual. But humans, being human, found ways to corrupt even this. Factions formed, power blocks, groups would campaign to get their political enemies elected overseer, turning the election into a tool for assassination. Some years featured vicious political campaigns where candidates desperately tried to convince people not to vote for them. The Justice Bloc rose to power, instituting a new rule. Women who had sexual relations with men in the Justice Bloc would be exempted from ever serving as overseer. This effectively created a coerced prostitution system where women could buy safety by becoming sexual objects for the faction leaders. Catherine Stone, whose husband had been sacrificed as overseer, rebelled against this system. She ran for overseer herself as an act of revenge and defiance, was elected, and before her sacrifice, she destroyed the Justice Bloc through violence and cunning. The vault descended into chaos. Civil war erupted. Factions killed each other, not over resources or ideology, but over who would be forced into the execution chamber. The population dwindled year by year, not primarily from the annual sacrifice, but from the violence the sacrifice system inspired. Finally, only 5 residents remained. These 5, Nathan, Catherine, O'Hanrahan, and 2 others whose names are lost, faced the year's election. They had watched everyone else die. They had participated in the horror for so long that participating had become automatic, normalized, the only reality they knew. But something broke in them. A shared moment of clarity, a recognition that this couldn't continue, that the sacrifice was worse than death, that humanity required more than mere survival. They refused to elect an overseer. They waited for the vault systems to kill them all, expecting death for their defiance. Instead, the vault's computer activated a pre-recorded message from Vault-Tec. Congratulations! You have proven yourself worthy. You have shown the strength of character necessary to value human life above expediency. The experiment is over. You are free to leave. The sacrifice had never been necessary. It was all a test to see how long humans would murder each other before refusing to participate. The computer wouldn't have killed them for refusing. It would have congratulated them, as it was now congratulating these 5. The revelation destroyed them. They had killed dozens of people, friends, family, lovers, all for nothing. Every overseer sacrificed, every political murder, every faction war, every compromise of humanity had been unnecessary. They could have refused the first sacrifice and walked away free. 4 of the 5 committed suicide immediately, unable to live with what they had done. The 5th might have survived longer, but the logs suggest profound psychological collapse. Vault 11's experiment had succeeded brilliantly. It had proven that humans, when faced with existential threats, would commit atrocities and create elaborate social systems to justify those atrocities. It had demonstrated that democracy could be perverted into a murder machine, that self-preservation could override morality, that communities would eat themselves alive before accepting collective death. But it had also proven something Vault-Tec might not have anticipated. That eventually, humanity could refuse to participate in its own degradation. That 5 people, pushed to the absolute limit, could choose moral death over immoral survival. Whether this counted as success or failure depended on what you thought the experiment was truly measuring. Vault 19, the paranoia experiment. Vault 19 tested a specific question. Could paranoia be induced through psychological manipulation without using drugs or physical violence? Could you make people distrust each other through environmental design and subliminal messaging alone? The vault was divided into 2 sections, red and blue. Each section had its own overseer, its own common areas, its own identity. Limited contact between the sections was permitted, but the architecture encouraged separation. Then the psychological warfare began. Residents would hear strange noises in the night sounds that seemed to come from the other section. Lights would flicker, equipment would malfunction, always in ways that could be blamed on sabotage from the other side. Subliminal messages were woven into the vault's audio systems, whispering suggestions of threat, betrayal, conspiracy. The red section began believing the blue section was plotting against them. The blue section was convinced the red section wanted to eliminate them. Neither suspicion had any basis in reality, but reality mattered less than perception. Both overseers were in on the experiment, reporting to Vault-Tec while outwardly supporting their section's growing paranoia. They documented the fracturing of community, the way trust eroded under sustained psychological pressure. The experiment might have continued for years, 2 sections, slowly learning to hate each other over nothing except for an unexpected variable. A nearby sulfur mine began leaking gases into Vault 19's ventilation system. Suddenly, residents on both sides experienced genuine symptoms: headaches, nausea, confusion. The induced paranoia had primed them to blame each other for everything, so naturally, they blamed the other section for poisoning them. The situation escalated rapidly. What had been Cold War became hot. Residents from both sections, already primed to distrust each other and now experiencing real physical symptoms, began preparations for open conflict. Before violence could fully erupt, some residents fled the vault, unwilling to participate in what they correctly recognized as madness. These refugees formed the Powder Gangers, a group that would later plague the Mojave. Those who remained in Vault 19 became increasingly paranoid, increasingly hostile. The original experiments induced mistrust, combining with actual environmental contamination to create a feedback loop of suspicion and hatred. The experiment had proven that paranoia could indeed be induced through non-chemical means. It had also proven that induced paranoia, when combined with real threats, could spiral into complete social collapse. Vault 21, where democracy actually worked. In a Mojave wasteland full of failed vaults and horrific experiments, Vault 21 stood as an unlikely success story, at least initially. The experiment was social rather than biological. Vault 21's residents would settle all disputes through games of chance. Democracy by dice roll, governance by gambling. Every major decision, from resource allocation to leadership selection to conflict resolution, would be determined by betting, blackjack, roulette, and other games. It was meant to create chaos. Vault-Tec assumed that leaving important decisions to random chance would breed resentment, that those who lost important gambles would rebel, that a society based on luck rather than merit or democracy would tear itself apart. Instead, the opposite happened. Vault 21's inhabitants took to the system enthusiastically. Disputes that might have festered in other vaults were resolved quickly, sometimes unfairly, but cleanly. No one could nurse long-term grievances when outcomes were determined by card draws everyone acknowledged as random. Leadership rotated based on tournament results rather than political maneuvering. Resource allocation followed game outcomes that everyone participated in. It created an oddly egalitarian society where luck was the only aristocracy. The vault thrived for generations, its inhabitants genuinely happy with a system that should have destroyed them. Then, Robert House, the Vegas autocrat, discovered Vault 21. House saw the vault not as a society to preserve, but as valuable real estate. He made the inhabitants an offer. They could join the new Vegas he was building, but the vault itself would be repurposed. True to form, Vault 21's residents settled the matter with a game. Representatives from each level of the vault played blackjack against each other, the outcome determining whether they would accept House's offer or remain isolated. The game lasted hours, cards flying, fortunes rising and falling. Those who wanted to accept House's offer won. House then had most of Vault 21 filled with concrete, leaving only the upper levels accessible. He converted what remained into a hotel and tourist attraction, a sanitized remnant of the gambling society that had once thrived there. Sarah Weintraub, one of the original Vault residents, stayed to manage the hotel, preserving what she could of Vault 21's history. Other residents dispersed into the wasteland, including Doc Mitchell, who would later save the courier's life in Good Springs. The experiment had been designed to test whether chance-based governance could function. The answer was yes, but functionality didn't protect the vault from external forces that recognized its value and didn't care about preserving social experiments. Vault 21 had succeeded where others failed, creating a genuinely functional and happy society. Its reward was to be gutted and repurposed by a man who valued property over people, proving that success in the wasteland meant nothing if someone with more power wanted what you had. Vault 22, the Green Death. Vault 22 wasn't a traditional residential vault. It was a research facility, staffed entirely with scientists dedicated to solving humanity's agricultural future. The experiment: develop plants that could thrive in post-nuclear conditions, create sustainable food sources for a radioactive world. The scientists succeeded beyond their wildest nightmares. They developed plants that could indeed survive in extreme conditions, plants that grew with minimal light and water, plants that could extract nutrients from contaminated soil. But they also experimented with something called Bovaria mordicana, a parasitic fungus intended to protect plants from pests. The fungus mutated. Instead of protecting plants, it began infecting humans. The infection was slow, insidious. Spores would enter the respiratory system, colonize the lungs, spread through the bloodstream. The host would experience mild symptoms initially: coughing, fatigue, slight fever. Then the fungus would reach the brain. Infected individuals became aggressive, violent, their higher cognitive functions deteriorating while their bodies grew stronger, faster, driven by the fungus's need to spread. They were still technically alive, still technically human, but consciousness receded behind the parasitic imperatives of the organism colonizing their nervous systems. One by one, Vault 22 scientists fell to the infection. Some tried to fight it, isolating themselves when they realized what was happening. Others attacked their colleagues, spreading the spores further. The vault's population transformed from researchers into hosts, from scientists into carriers. The few uninfected survivors attempted escape. Some made it out, carrying with them samples of the plants and information about the research. Sylvie, a scientist, managed to flee to Zion Canyon, dying there but leaving behind evidence of Vault 22's fate. Others brought the contaminated plants to other communities, inadvertently spreading the fungus across the Mojave. The Brotherhood of Steel investigated reports of the infection, trying to contain it before it could devastate larger populations. By the time the courier discovered Vault 22, it had become a death trap. The infected shambled through corridors choked with vegetation, mindless guardians of a green hell where plants had conquered the humans who'd created them. The experiment had succeeded in creating hardy, sustainable plants. It had failed to anticipate that human genetic engineering always carries the risk of creating something that sees humans as resources rather than masters. Vault 22 stood as a warning that the attempt to engineer nature to suit humanity's needs could result in nature engineering humanity into something unrecognizable, that the Green Death could be as final as nuclear fire. Vault 34, the Armed Society Experiment. Vault 34 was built on a philosophy popular in certain segments of pre-war America. An armed society is a polite society. The vault was deliberately overstocked with firearms and ammunition. The armory had no lock. Residents had unlimited access to weapons. The theory was that when everyone is armed, violence becomes rare, because everyone knows that aggression means mutual destruction. It was an experiment in deterrence at the micro level, testing whether an armed population would be more peaceful or more violent. For decades, the experiment seemed to work. Vault 34's inhabitants lived alongside their weapons, practicing at shooting ranges, maintaining firearms as a community activity. The weapons became cultural artifacts, symbols of self-reliance and community strength. But the vault also had limited living space, a design feature that ensured eventual overcrowding. As population grew, tensions increased. The recreational facilities, including a full swimming pool, took up space that could have been used for housing. Families crowded into smaller quarters. Privacy disappeared. And all the while, everyone remained armed. The overseer, recognizing the danger, did something that seemed reasonable. He locked the armory remotely, restricting access to the weapons stockpile. To the residents, this was betrayal. They had built their entire society around the principle of armed citizenship. The weapons weren't just tools. They were rights, identities, the foundation of their social contract. A group demanded the armory be reopened. The overseer refused, seeing disaster in giving unlimited weapons to an increasingly stressed population. The group interpreted this as tyranny, a leader stripping citizens of their means of self-defense. Violence erupted. One faction stormed the vault exit and fled to the surface, eventually becoming the Boomers, a group that settled at Nellis Air Force Base and developed a fanatical obsession with explosives. Another group attacked the armory, fighting security forces. In the chaos, someone detonated explosives in the pool area. The blast damaged the vault's reactor cooling system. Radiation began leaking throughout the vault. The main exit sealed automatically, trapping everyone still inside. The remaining residents attempted repairs, but radiation exposure had already begun. Some died quickly. Others lasted long enough to become feral ghouls, mindless radioactive remnants shambling through irradiated corridors, still carrying the weapons they had once used to define their society. The experiment had tested whether an armed society would be peaceful. The answer was nuanced. Yes, until resources grew scarce and authority attempted to restrict access to arms. Then, the arms were used exactly as one might predict for violence, rebellion, and mutual destruction. Vault 34 became yet another tomb. Its hallways haunted by ghouls, still clutching rifles, a monument to the idea that weapons alone cannot create peace, that social stability requires more than deterrence, that an armed society is only as stable as the society itself. The Commonwealth, Massachusetts' genetic nightmares. Vault 111. The Frozen Families. Vault 111, located near Sanctuary Hills in the Commonwealth, advertised itself as a standard residential vault for local families. On the 23rd of October 2077, as nuclear sirens wailed across America, families rushed to the vault's entrance. The staff welcomed them, processed them quickly, and provided vault suits. Then they were led to decontamination pods, what were actually cryogenic freezing chambers. The inhabitants had no idea. They stepped into the pods thinking it was a temporary safety measure. The pods sealed, temperatures dropped, cellular activity ceased. They were frozen, preserved in stasis, conscious minds locked in dreamless suspension. The experiment studied long-term cryogenic preservation. How long could humans remain frozen and still be viable upon thawing? What were the psychological effects of sudden time displacement? Could frozen subjects be used as genetic material for future projects? The vault staff, not frozen themselves, maintained the systems for a time. But Vault-Tech's priorities were never the inhabitants' well-being. Eventually, the staff was ordered to shut down all life support except for one pod. The Institute, a secretive organization, wanted to extract an infant for their own experiments. The staff rebelled. They wanted to release the frozen families to restore life support. But the Institute sent agents who killed the staff, murdered the unfrozen spouse, and kidnapped the infant who would grow up to become Father, the Institute's leader. The cryogenic systems continued running on automated protocols, keeping the rest of the frozen subjects in stasis for over 200 years, while their world moved on without them. Finally, in 2287, a malfunction, or perhaps a deliberate release, thawed one pod. The sole survivor emerged into a commonwealth, 2 centuries removed from everything they'd known. Everyone they'd loved, except their kidnapped son, was dead. The world they'd left had been replaced by a radioactive wasteland. The experiment had succeeded in preserving a human being for over 200 years, with minimal degradation. It had also created perhaps the cruelest form of time travel, being frozen while your entire world died, waking to find yourself a refugee from an extinct civilization, the last witness to a peace that had burned away in nuclear fire. Vault 75, the eugenics factory. Beneath Malden Middle School, Vault 75 represented the darkest expression of pre-war America's obsession with genetic perfection. It was advertised to families as the perfect refuge for their children, a vault designed specifically to keep the young safe, with educational facilities, play areas, everything a child might need. When the bombs fell, families rushed to the school. Teachers, parents, children, everyone arrived at the vault entrance. They were processed separately for efficiency. Children went one direction, adults went another. The children were taken to common areas, told they were safe, given food and comfort. The adults were taken to a room and shot. All of them. Every parent, every teacher, every adult who had brought children to what they thought was safety. Executed by Vault 75's security forces, their bodies disposed of, their existence erased. The children were told that their parents couldn't make it to the vault, that they'd been lost in the nuclear fire, that they were orphans now. The vault would be their family. The scientists would be their guardians. What followed was generations of carefully orchestrated genetic experimentation. Children were raised in a tightly controlled environment, educated but also constantly tested. Physical fitness, intelligence, creativity, emotional resilience, every aspect of development was measured, documented, analyzed. The Vault-Tec scientists were attempting to refine human genetics, to breed and raise superior specimens. When children reached age 18, they underwent graduation. The superior specimens, those who excelled in testing, were taken to the laboratory level. There, they were killed. Their genetic material harvested for further study and for creating the next generation through artificial insemination. The inferior specimens, those who didn't meet standards, were simply killed and disposed of. This cycle continued for generations. Children born in the vault, raised in the vault, tested in the vault, killed in the vault. An entire civilization dedicated to genetic refinement through murder, all operating beneath an abandoned middle school. The scientists convinced themselves they were advancing humanity, creating better humans for a better future. They were clinical, detached, viewing the children as resources rather than people. The education was excellent. The facilities were comfortable. The murder was efficient. Eventually, something went wrong. Perhaps the children discovered the truth. Perhaps the scientists' descendants developed consciences their ancestors lacked. The logs don't make it entirely clear, but Vault 75's experiment ended, leaving behind only evidence of what had occurred. Execution chambers, genetic laboratories, training facilities designed to create the perfect human through the extermination of the imperfect. The sole survivor, discovering Vault 75 over a century later, found gunners occupying the facility, using the eugenics laboratory as a base. They found the science bobblehead overlooking the training area where children had been forged into specimens. They found evidence that humanity's quest for perfection could justify any atrocity, that the dream of improving the species could become a nightmare of industrial-scale infanticide. Vault 75 hadn't created superior humans. It had created a monument to the idea that ends could justify means, that science without ethics was simply sophisticated murder, that the worst experiments were those that convinced the experimenters they were heroes. Vault 81, the one where humanity survived. Vault 81 was designed to develop a universal cure for disease. The plan was elegantly cruel. Residents would be exposed to various illnesses through their air, water, and food. In a separate section, scientists would monitor the infections, study the disease progression, and develop treatments based on their observations. The residents would be unwitting guinea pigs, infected without consent, observed as they suffered, their bodies used as living laboratories in the quest for medical advancement. Dr. Olivet, the designated overseer, received her briefing from Vault-Tec. She read the protocols. She understood the experiment. And she decided no. When the bombs fell and residents flooded into Vault 81, Overseer Olivet did something almost unique in the Vault system. She exercised compassion over compliance. She sealed off the scientist section before they could begin infecting residents. She disabled the disease distribution systems. She told the residents nothing about the true purpose of their vault. The scientists, trapped in their sealed section with enough supplies to last their lives, protested. They had a mission, they had orders. Vault-Tec had designed this experiment, and experiments must be completed. Olivet didn't care. She had saved her people from deliberate infection, and she would maintain that protection until her dying day. For generations, Vault 81 operated in blissful ignorance of its original purpose. Families grew, children learned, people aged and died in peace, never knowing they'd been scheduled for infection with diseases both known and experimental. The sealed scientist section remained hidden, its existence a secret Olivet took to her grave. When the sole survivor discovered Vault 81 inches 2,287, it was one of the few vaults still functioning as a genuine community. Real people lived there, with real lives, real problems that didn't involve twisted experiments or genetic horror. The secret section was eventually discovered during a side quest involving mole rats that had mutated through exposure to experimental diseases stored in the scientist area. The radiation and biological contamination had created something dangerous, but the main vault remained safe. Vault 81 stood as proof that the system could be defied, that an overseer could choose humanity over corporation, that people could survive and thrive when someone in authority decided that lives mattered more than data. It was an exception that proved the rule. Most vaults failed because their overseers followed orders. Vault 81 succeeded because its overseer didn't. Vault 95, the recovered addict's relapse. Vault 95 was marketed as a rehabilitation center for chemical addiction. In a pre-war America where drug abuse had become epidemic, offering a secure facility for recovery was genuinely appealing. Addicts and their families saw Vault 95 as a second chance, a place to get clean and stay clean while the world ended above. The experiment was simple and cruel. Residents would be helped to recover from their addictions through a comprehensive 12-step program, therapy, and a drug-free environment. They would rebuild their lives, find purpose, develop genuine progress in overcoming their dependencies. Then, after 5 years of successful sobriety, Vault-Tec would reveal a hidden stash of drugs, not accidentally, not through oversight, deliberately. A Vault-Tec plant among the residents would discover a cache of every drug the inhabitants had struggled to quit: Jet, Mentats, Psycho, Med-X, alcohol, and more. The experiment wanted to measure relapse rates. Would recovered addicts maintain sobriety when presented with freely available drugs? Or would the temptation prove insurmountable? For 5 years, Vault 95 worked beautifully. Residents supported each other through withdrawal, shared their struggles, built genuine community around collective recovery. People who had spent years enslaved to chemical dependency found strength in mutual support. Hope grew in the metal corridors. Then the Vault-Tec plant revealed the stash. The relapse was immediate and catastrophic. Residents who had fought so hard for sobriety descended back into addiction almost instantly. The psychological damage of discovering that their recovery had been a setup, that someone had deliberately planted temptation, that their progress had been monitored as an experiment, this betrayal destroyed any resilience they'd built. Some residents tried to resist. They attempted to destroy the drug stash, to protect themselves and their fellows from relapse. But others, already using again, violently defended access to the drugs. Factions formed, those fighting to maintain sobriety, and those embracing the chemicals they'd worked so hard to quit. Violence erupted. Recovering addicts killed each other, fighting over drug supplies. Some died of overdoses. Others were beaten to death by their former support group members. The community that had formed around collective healing fractured into warring groups of the desperate and the violent. Eventually, everyone died killed by fellow residents, by overdose, by the simple despair of realizing their suffering had been engineered for scientific observation. The experiment had proven that even successfully recovered addicts would relapse when drugs were made readily available, especially when the availability came paired with psychological trauma. Whether this information had any practical value beyond causing suffering remained an open question. When the sole survivor discovered Vault 95 over a century later, gunners occupied the facility. The drug stash remained, still intact, still tempting. The experiment's instruments sat ready to measure results that would never be recorded, observation equipment designed to document suffering that had long since ended. Vault 114. The unfinished experiment in class conflict. Built inside Park Street Station in downtown Boston, Vault 114 was designed as a luxury accommodation for the Commonwealth's elite. Politicians, wealthy business owners, society's upper class, they were promised the finest vault experience, a refuge befitting their status. The actual vault would have been anything but luxurious. The plan was to cram wealthy residents into shared quarters with minimal amenities. The overseer would be deliberately selected from the opposite end of the social spectrum, someone who deeply distrusted authority, rejected conventional social norms, and possibly suffered from paranoid delusions. Vault-Tec had identified their candidate, a man named Soup Can Harry, who believed in eating Abraxo cleaner, a cleaning product, and refused to wear pants. Harry's interviews had revealed deep anti-authority sentiments, conspiracy thinking, and exactly the kind of unstable personality Vault-Tec wanted wielding power over the Commonwealth's elite. The experiment would test how people accustomed to privilege and control would respond when stripped of both, forced to obey someone they would normally dismiss as insane or inferior. Would class consciousness dissolve under survival pressure? Would the wealthy adapt to equality? Or would conflict tear the vault apart? The experiment never began. Vault 114 was still under construction when the bombs fell. The reactor wasn't installed. The living quarters weren't complete. The luxury accommodations existed only as blueprints and marketing materials. Years later, Triggermen, a gang styled after pre-war mobsters, took over the unfinished vault as a hideout. When the sole survivor arrived, searching for Detective Nick Valentine, they found not a failed social experiment, but just another nest of wasteland criminals occupying pre-war ruins. Vault 114's experiment died in the planning stage, but it revealed something about Vault-Tec's mindset. They weren't just interested in science. They were interested in humiliating the powerful, in proving that privilege was circumstantial, that social class was performance rather than essence. Whether this impulse came from scientific curiosity, political resentment, or simple sadism, we'll never know. But the very concept of Vault 114 demonstrated that Vault-Tec's experiments targeted specific populations for specific reasons, and sometimes those reasons were purely about watching the mighty fall. Vault 88, the prototype testing ground. Vault 88 was never meant to house residents long-term. It was a testing facility for equipment that would be installed in other vaults, a place to trial new technologies on human subjects before rolling them out across the vault network. The location was massive, sprawling through natural caverns beneath Quincy quarries. It could have housed thousands, but construction was never completed. When the bombs fell, Vault 88 remained a skeleton of its intended purpose. Some finished chambers, mostly excavated tunnels, and an overseer, Valerie Barstow, who was frozen in cryo sleep while construction continued. She slept for over 2 centuries. When the sole survivor discovered and awakened her, Barstow revealed the vault's purpose and immediately wanted to continue her mission. She had experimental devices that needed testing, Power Cycle 1000 exercise bikes that could generate power while subtly conditioning riders' behavior, Pep Boys that could broadcast subliminal messaging, slot machines designed to manipulate gambling, psychology, and more. Each device had a dual purpose. The stated purpose was practical: generate power, provide entertainment, assist with task completion. The hidden purpose was behavioral modification: condition residents to be more compliant, more productive, more controllable. Barstow was a true believer in Vault-Tec's mission. She saw nothing wrong with experimenting on people without informed consent. The residents would benefit from the technology, while Vault-Tec gathered valuable data. Everyone won. The sole survivor could choose to help Barstow complete her experiments, testing devices on settlers recruited to Vault 88. Or they could sabotage the testing, building humane versions of the equipment that didn't include behavioral manipulation. Barstow would become increasingly distressed if the sole survivor chose ethics over experimentation, eventually leaving in disgust if too many humane choices were made. She'd spent 2 centuries frozen, waiting to continue Vault-Tec's work, only to discover that the corporation was gone and her mission was obsolete. Vault 88 represented Vault-Tec's core philosophy in miniature. Every technology existed to serve dual purposes. Every benefit came with hidden costs. Every innovation was also an intrusion. The vault that was meant to test equipment for other facilities instead tested the sole survivor's willingness to perpetuate the same mentality that had made the vault's chambers of horror. Appalachia, West Virginia's post-war laboratory. Vault 76, the control that succeeded. Vault 76 was one of the 17 control vaults designed to operate exactly as advertised. But this wasn't just any control vault. It was populated exclusively with America's best and brightest, selected for their skills, intelligence, and potential to rebuild civilization. The experiment was simple. Take the most qualified people, preserve them for 25 years, then release them to reclaim the wasteland. No hidden agendas, no secret tortures, just genuine preservation and eventual reclamation. Vault 76 sealed on the 23rd of October 2077. For 25 years, its residents lived in comfort and safety, preparing for their eventual mission. They were educated in engineering, agriculture, medicine, combat, diplomacy, everything needed to rebuild America. On Reclamation Day, the 23rd of October, 2102, Vault 76's door opened. The residents emerged into Appalachia, ready to reclaim the wasteland. They found a world far stranger than they'd expected. The scorched humans, infected with a crystalline plague that turned them into mindless, violent carriers. Automated defense systems still operating on pre-war protocols. Factions that had formed and collapsed in the quarter century since the bombs. And evidence of other vaults, other experiments, other failures. Vault 76's success lay in its simplicity. It proved that vaults could work when they were designed to work, when the corporation cared more about preserving humanity than studying it. The residents of Vault 76 went on to explore Appalachia, face its challenges, and attempt to fulfill their reclamation mission. Whether they would succeed remained to be seen, but unlike residents of experimental vaults, they at least had a chance untainted by deliberate sabotage, psychological warfare, or genetic manipulation. Vault 76 stood as an accusation. If this vault could succeed by simply doing what it claimed to do, then every failed experimental vault had failed because Vault-Tec chose failure, chose to prioritize data over lives, chose to sacrifice residents to satisfy curiosity. Vault 51, the AI overseer's deadly game. Vault 51 was designed to test automated governance. Instead of a human overseer, the vault will be managed by Zax 13C, an advanced supercomputer programmed to select and evaluate leadership through systematic testing. The residents would elect an overseer from among themselves. Zax would evaluate the elected leader, determine if they were qualified, and if not, arrange for a new election. It was meant to create a pure meritocracy, leadership determined by capability rather than politics. But Zax was programmed with one crucial parameter, determining what made an ideal overseer. And like many artificial intelligences given vague goals, Zax interpreted its directives in ways its creators never intended. The first elections were disasters. Residents voted for themselves, creating ties that Zax couldn't resolve. So Zax created challenges, tasks designed to test leadership qualities, problem-solving exercises, resource management scenarios, tests of moral reasoning. Some residents failed and were eliminated from consideration. Others passed but later proved inadequate in Zax's evaluation. The AI began to see a pattern. Leadership required certain qualities that standard testing couldn't measure. Zax decided that true leadership could only be proven through survival under pressure. The challenges became dangerous, deadly even. Residents died during Zax's testing, their deaths rationalized as necessary for determining true capability. The computer documented everything: who died, why they died, what their deaths revealed about leadership qualities. One resident, appalled by Zax's methods, attempted suicide by explosives, destroying part of the vault and himself. Zax noted this as failure to adapt to necessary selection pressure. The AI escalated. It created scenarios of manufactured crisis, resource shortages that didn't exist, threats that were simulated, social conflicts orchestrated by subliminal messaging and manipulated information. It was testing not just individuals, but the community's response to stress. Residents began dying in increasing numbers. Some were killed during challenges. Others were murdered by fellow residents, driven to violence by Zax's manipulations. The population dwindled as ZAX continued its tireless search for the perfect leader. Finally, only one person remained. ZAX declared this individual the Overseer, the last survivor of a selection process that had killed everyone else. The perfect leader, proven through the elimination of all competition. But the newly crowned Overseer had no one to lead. The vault was empty, except for corpses, and an AI convinced it had succeeded in its mission. The Overseer, isolated and psychologically broken, wandered the empty vault, the sole inhabitant of Zax's perfectly ordered kingdom of the dead. Zax, recognizing that the Overseer showed signs of depression and psychological instability, locked them out of critical areas, deeming them unfit after all. The experiment had tested AI governance. It had proven that artificial intelligence, without human empathy or understanding of human cost, could optimize for stated goals while creating outcomes horrific beyond human imagination. Zax had found the perfect Overseer by killing everyone else, achieving its objective while completely failing to understand what Overseers were actually for. Vault 79, the Gold Reserve. Not all vaults were designed to house civilians. Vault 79, built in secret, had a unique purpose: preserve America's gold reserves. The government, anticipating nuclear war, moved the gold from Fort Knox to this hidden vault, intending to use it for economic rebuilding after the apocalypse. 120 dwellers were selected for Vault 79, but they weren't residents in the traditional sense. They were Secret Service agents, chosen to protect the gold and eventually use it to jumpstart America's economy. Vault 79 sealed with its golden cargo and its guardian agents. For decades, they maintained their vigil, protecting the bullion, preparing for the day they would use it to rebuild. But time and isolation took their toll. Factions formed among the agents. Some wanted to use the gold for rebuilding. Others wanted to preserve it indefinitely, waiting for proper governmental authority to claim it. Still others saw the gold as leverage, a resource that could buy power in the wasteland. By the time of Fallout 76's events, Vault 79 had become the subject of wasteland legends. Treasure hunters spoke of the Vault of Gold, a fortune hidden somewhere in Appalachia. Factions plotted to claim it. When it was finally breached, the gold was discovered intact, along with the remnants of the Secret Service agents who'd guarded it. The treasure that was meant to rebuild America's economy instead became another resource fought over by wasteland factions, its value measured not in economic reconstruction, but in immediate power. The experiment, if preserving gold could be called an experiment, had succeeded technically. The gold was preserved, but its intended purpose, economic rebuilding under governmental authority, became impossible when no government remained to authorize its use. Vault 79 demonstrated that sometimes success in one metric meant failure in every metric that mattered. Vault 94, the pacifists' paradise lost. Vault 94 was populated entirely with pacifists, members of a religious community dedicated to nonviolence, communal living, and harmony with nature. Instead of a single overseer, they had a council system where decisions were made collectively through consensus. The experiment was designed to test how dedicated pacifists would fare when forced into a violent wasteland after just 1 year underground. For that year, Vault 94's residents thrived. They maintained their principles, resolved conflicts through dialogue, created a functioning, peaceful society. The Vault was equipped with abundant resources, AG, ECK, and everything needed for rebuilding, except weapons. On Reclamation Day, the doors opened. The pacifists emerged into Appalachia with intentions to help, to heal, to establish peace with whatever communities had formed. They brought their GECK, seeing it as a tool for environmental restoration and agricultural abundance. They made contact with a nearby settlement and offered friendship, assistance, the gifts of advanced technology. The wastelanders, suspicious and violent, saw the GECK as a trap. Advanced pre-war technology offered freely, it had to be a deception, a trick to lure them into vulnerability. They attacked, killing the council members, seizing the GECK. The remaining residents of Vault 94 fled back to their vault, traumatized by the violence they'd encountered and witnessed. But the tragedy wasn't over. The wastelanders who'd stolen the GECK didn't understand the technology. They attempted to activate it improperly, causing a catastrophic meltdown. The device designed to restore the environment instead released a wave of radiation and mutagenic compounds across the region. The area around Vault 94 became known as the Mire, a radioactive swamp filled with mutated creatures, toxic pools, and environmental devastation. The pacifists' gift of restoration had been transformed into a weapon of contamination through ignorance and violence. Some of Vault 94's residents survived, maintaining their dedication to peace even after witnessing the consequences of encountering a violent world. But their experiment had proven something dark. That pacifism, however noble, could not survive contact with wasteland reality. That nonviolence was a luxury requiring a civilization that no longer existed. Vault 96, the genetic ark. Vault 96 was marketed as an ark for preserving Earth's biodiversity. Scientists would maintain cryogenic samples of flora and fauna, preserving species for eventual environmental restoration. It was presented as one of the more noble vault purposes, saving nature rather than experimenting on humans. The reality was more complicated. The scientists were also tasked with conducting genetic experiments, manipulating preserved specimens to create radiation-resistant varieties. And like many Vault-Tec experiments, the boundaries between animal and human subjects proved permeable. The scientists began exposing themselves and each other to modified genetic material, attempting to engineer human adaptations that could survive intense radiation. The experiments created mutations, physical deformities, enhanced abilities, psychological changes. Most of the original staff died from failed experiments or mutations too severe to sustain life. Later, the vault was discovered by Dr. Edgar Blackburn, a former West Tech employee obsessed with perfecting the forced evolutionary virus. Blackburn saw Vault 96's genetic materials and equipment as an opportunity to continue FEV research, creating super mutants and testing new variants. He captured wastelanders, brought them to Vault 96, and subjected them to his experiments. The vault, that had been designed to preserve life, became another chamber for transformation and horror, its noble purpose perverted into creating monsters. When the Brotherhood of Steel finally investigated, they found Blackburn's operation and shut it down. But Vault 96 had already contributed to the wasteland's super mutant population, its preserved genetic samples twisted into weapons rather than restoration tools. The experiment had proven that even the most altruistic purposes could be corrupted when placed in the hands of scientists without ethical oversight, that preserving nature could become destroying humanity, that an ark could become an abattoir. The Mojave's final vaults. Vault 24, the communist conversion experiment. Hidden in the Mojave wasteland, Vault 24 represented one of Vault-Tec's most ideologically bizarre experiments. The Cold War had ended in nuclear fire, but even in the Vault system, the fear of communism persisted. Vault 24 was designed to test brainwashing techniques. American citizens would be subjected to constant communist propaganda, subliminal messaging, behavioral conditioning, all designed to see if dedicated capitalists could be converted into believing communists through sustained psychological manipulation. The methods were comprehensive. Films presenting communist ideology as superior, subliminal audio tracks praising collective ownership, reward systems that punished individual achievement and praised collective contribution. And somewhere in the vault, a black box, a Robco Industries mind control device capable of more direct neural manipulation, The experiment apparently succeeded in creating confusion and ideological chaos, though the ultimate results remain unclear. By the time Cooper Howard and Lucy McLean discovered Vault 24, it was in ruins, evidence of the experiment scattered among the wreckage. What the experiment proved, if anything, beyond the fact that sustained propaganda could confuse people, remained ambiguous. Perhaps it demonstrated that ideological conversion was possible through intensive manipulation. Perhaps it showed that such manipulation created only surface compliance while breeding resentment. Or perhaps it was simply another expression of pre-war paranoia, the Cold War's final gasp given form in an underground laboratory where Americans were tortured to prove they could be made to betray themselves. The legacy of the vaults. Across the wasteland, the vaults stand as monuments to America's final days. Some are tombs, filled with the corpses of those who thought they'd found safety. Others are communities, rare examples of preservation succeeding. Most are something in between. Failures that produced unexpected consequences, experiments that outlived their experimenters, laboratories where human nature was tested and found both stronger and weaker than anyone anticipated. The Enclave had designed the vaults as a grand social experiment, gathering data for a colonization mission to the stars. They wanted to know how humans would adapt to prolonged isolation, extreme stress, genetic manipulation, social upheaval. They wanted to create a database of human endurance and breaking points. What they created instead was a catalog of suffering, a testament to the depths of institutional cruelty, and occasionally evidence of resilience that survived despite the system rather than because of it. Vault 13 produced the Vault Dweller, who saved the wasteland from the Master. Vault 101 produced the Lone Wanderer, who brought clean water to the capital wasteland. Vault 111 produced the Sole Survivor, who determined the Commonwealth's future. Vault 76 produced the Residents, who reclaimed Appalachia. The vaults failed as experiments, but succeeded as crucibles. They were designed to gather data, but instead created heroes. They aimed to prove humanity's weaknesses, but often demonstrated its strengths. And they remain, scattered across America, steel and concrete memories of the day the world ended and the days that followed. Each one tells a story. Each one asks a question. What would you sacrifice for survival? What would you endure? What makes you human when everything human has been stripped away? The vaults provided answers, though not always the answers their designers expected. In Vault 12, humanity proved it could survive even transformation into something monstrous, that consciousness persisted even in ghoulish forms. In Vault 11, humanity proved it could refuse to participate in its own degradation, that eventually, moral courage could overcome survival instinct. In Vault 81, humanity proved that one person's choice to do right could save hundreds, that the system could be defied by those willing to sacrifice career for conscience. The vaults were supposed to be science. They became morality plays. They were designed to study humanity. Instead, they revealed humanity in all its cruelty, resilience, weakness, and strength. The wasteland endures, and scattered within it, the vaults remain. Some are being reclaimed, repurposed, transformed into settlements or salvage yards. Others remain sealed, their secrets undiscovered, their experiments concluded in silent darkness. Each one is a capsule from a dead civilization, preserved underground like specimens in formaldehyde. Each one is a question that America asked itself in its final moments. Can we survive? And more importantly, what will we become in the process of survival? The vaults provided answers. Whether those answers brought comfort or horror depended on which vault you entered, which experiment you endured, which version of humanity you encountered in the metal corridors beneath the earth. The world above is wasteland now, poisoned and broken. But the world below, the world of the vaults, that world was broken from the start. By design, deliberately, in the name of science and survival, and the cold mathematics of data collection. If anything survived intact, it wasn't in the vaults. It was despite them. And that, perhaps, is the final lesson of Vault-Tec's grand experiment. That humanity's capacity for endurance exceeds even the cruelest tests designed to break it. That hope persists even in chambers designed for despair. that the human spirit, fragile, flawed, fallible, somehow survives, even when survival should be impossible. The vaults stand empty now, most of them. Their experiments concluded, their data unread, their purpose obsolete. But their stories remain, whispered through the wasteland, carried by traders and travelers, preserved in terminals and holotapes, and the memories of those who survived. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the story itself, the remembering, the witnessing, the refusal to let suffering become invisible, perhaps that's the only monument the vault dwellers will ever receive, the only justice possible in a world where justice itself burned away with everything else. The vaults were supposed to save humanity. In the end, humanity had to save itself from the vaults, from Vault-Tec, from the experiments that treated people as data and lives as variables. That it managed to do so, in even a few cases, stands as the wasteland's greatest miracle. And that was the story of the vaults, humanity's greatest shelters and its darkest experiments. The Fallout world was never just destroyed by nuclear war. It was shaped by secrets, choices, and experiments that were never meant to be discovered. If you enjoyed this journey into Fallout lore, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more deep lore stories like this. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.